Forget Brexit, forget Trump, forget the decade of centenaries, forget 1690 and all that. I want to bring you tidings of a less ephemeral nature, because much of the paper is about deep history, pathways to salvation and eternal life, and the implications for people's lives over the last millennium or so. Now, children growing up in the Ireland of the 1950s will have a clear remembrance of a metaphysical place or space called limbo. For Catholics, Roman Catholics, they're not Irish Protestants, this formed part of a spiritual cosmos which viewed heaven at one pole and hell at the opposite pole, and limbo and purgatory occupied intermediate positions between those two, somewhat indeterminate as well. Now, fast forward to the present day, and hardly anyone, and I've been testing this, hanging about the streets, asking people about limbo, hardly anyone born since about 2000 or perhaps earlier has any idea what limbo is and what I was getting at, other than as a figure of speech. So, what was limbo? Limbo, as understood within the Christian faith and after the Reformation within the Catholic or Roman Catholic faith, was a place where unbaptized babies went to. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that is the shorter version. And the Green Catechism, in which certainly I was schooled in, and which generations of school children were schooled, came out in 1951, and did service, I think, for about 1 to 2 decades. At the imprimatur of Joannes Carolus, Archbishop John McQuaid of Dublin, and it contains the essential elements of belief. And the chain of concepts ran from the fall of Adam and Eve, and hence original sin, from there to baptism, and in some instances to limbo. I'll explain that in a moment. Sorry, my assistant will explain it in a moment. But a few other words before that. The first parents of the human race were Adam and Eve. Adam ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Paradise, and for this act of disobedience, Adam and Eve were banished. But not only that, all subsequent humanity was punished. So a kind of collective punishment. And we'll just look at the catechism in a moment. So it's a kind of recreation of a national school in the south of Ireland circa 1960. So, can I read the first? We have 3, thanks. So it's a question and answer format. Have we, the children of Adam, suffered because of his sin? You can turn around if you like.
Because of Adam's sin, we are born without sanctifying grace. Our intellect is darkened, our will is weakened, our passions incline us to evil, and we are subject to suffering and death.
Hang on. Have we, the children of Adam, suffered because of his sin?
We've already done that.
Oh yes, sorry. I clearly wasn't listening to you. Okay, following question. How do we call the state in which we are born because of the sin of Adam?
The state in which we are born because of the sin of Adam is called the state of original sin.
Why is original sin so called?
Original sin is so called because it comes down through our origin or descent from Adam, the head of the human race.
Very good, thank you. And there are actually more than 400 questions in that category. It's all right, you don't have to do any more. Question 344 is, is baptism necessary for salvation? So those are those two. And this is crucial. Is baptism necessary for salvation? You can chorus with me if you like. Baptism is necessary for salvation because our divine Lord has said, unless a man be born again of water and the Holy Ghost, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. Now, that gives rise to a terrible dilemma. Because original sin is stamped on the souls of all, and including stillbirths and the newly born, these souls cannot enter heaven if they fail to receive the sacrament of baptism, which is, according to the scriptures, or these scriptures, is the only means to eternal salvation. Now, that perplexed both theologians and presumably parents, and in the 19th, 20th centuries explains the rush to have infants baptised as soon as possible. And in more recent decades, theological debates have focused on limbo again, rather to my surprise, and the reason being because of the prevalence of abortion in the modern world. And that, of course, gives rise to some other difficult issues in terms of that doctrine. Now, let me say a little bit about the origin of the idea of limbo. The term limbo doesn't appear in the Bible, but theological discussions of the, not of limbo, but of the fate of unbaptized babies go back to the 5th century. St. Augustine, who was born in the late 4th century, took a pretty hard line on this. And it was quite simple. Unbaptized babies went straight to hell. And that was that. So, small wonder, as Dermot McCulloch writes, that creative Christian thinkers might speculate about some middle state. And so, theologians came to invent a notion, this is in the early Middle Ages, a notion of limbus infantium, a place where unbaptized babies were warehoused, but free from the torments of hell. And really that theological invention, with some variations in emphasis, variations as between different doctors of the church, did serve us down to the 20th century within the Catholic tradition. And so in 2008, we have the findings of the Vatican's International Theological Commission. And the title of the document is The Hope for Salvation for Infants Who Die Before Being Baptized. I can't remember if I put this on or not. No, I didn't. Anyhow, the hope for salvation for infants who die before being baptized. And the findings of that commission, which were largely misrepresented in the mass media, because some may recall headings such as Pope abolishes limbo. Well, that, unless the doctrine has changed recently, that is not the case. The Theological Commission gave various reasons why unbaptized babies should not go to a place called limbo and might be saved. But it also says that the notion of limbo is a theory, a hypothesis, and it might be correct, or it might not. So you can take it or leave it. But as I understand it, limbo has not been abolished. You make your choices. Incidentally, I should say, and this document is online, it's very well written. I think it's a model of historiographical writing. And it's free of, I've read virtually no theological writings. I was pleasantly surprised to find that at least this and some other writings I've been looking at are remarkably free of any kind of jargon. something some of us in the social sciences might consider. Now, so that's the official position as I understand it at the moment. I could say a little bit more about the fate of the just. Let's leave that. And really the substance is about the unbaptized infants. Now, shifting down to the level of the people, you might think at first sight that all of this is simply the musings of theologians. But I'm going to argue that a belief in limbo had important implications for people's lives. It affected not only how people might fare in the next life, but also their experiences and actions in this life, in this world as well. So the study, and it really is a preliminary study, it's based on the recollections of 26 Irish mothers. I used a postal questionnaire facilitated by the Irish Countrywomen's Association. And since a number of them wrote back to me and gave email addresses or telephone numbers, I was able to continue some of the discussions and correspondence with some of them. The respondents come from, they're widely scattered across Ireland from the 4 provinces, but clearly given the smallish numbers, 26, it's not possible to conduct a regional analysis. Because there may well be variations between different dioceses and parishes, but that's not something I can say anything about at this stage. But I should say I'm extremely grateful to the Irish Countrywomen's Association, who were wonderfully cooperative. Actually thought this was a good idea, to my surprise. And perhaps another word or two about the questionnaires. These were quite open-ended, so that respondents might elaborate as they saw fit. And what came back, I think, was deeply revealing and some very vivid accounts. And let me say a little bit about age, because different cohorts, their experiences may vary. So the age breakdown was as follows. 2 were born in the 1930s, 9 in the 1940s, 11 in the 1950s, and 3 in the 1960s. But, I think it's a fairly good spread, both age-wise and geographically. Now, a belief in limbo, perhaps worth making, is a terribly obvious point, but perhaps worth making. A belief in limbo has to come from somewhere outside of the self, as it's not a state that can be directly observed or experienced. So that would be worth asking people where they got their sources of belief in limbo. And more or less, as you might expect, 21% from the mother. Yeah, interestingly, the father also is mentioned as a source of belief in limbo. And what I found kind of interesting was that publications didn't matter at all, at least in terms of this small sample, nor did other refers to friends, which may suggest that Irish Catholics on the whole don't discuss religion very much with each other or read that much about it, or perhaps it doesn't. Incidentally, teachers there probably encompasses nuns in some instances as well, because these are female respondents and many of them would have been attending convent schools. Now, what kind of place was limbo? Well, these are the responses that came back, and I can't do justice to the richness of these. I'll just use a number of examples that have come through. Some dark place, never to see the sight of God. I imagined it like a cave, not to see any light again. Another remarked, visualise some sort of a dark corridor with strangely shaped people, tiny creatures, waiting. Waiting, incidentally, is a word that is repeated over and over again. Explained by my mother that babies, this is in case some people can't see from the back, explained by my mother that babies couldn't go to church or be buried at the cemetery if not baptised, as they still had original sin. I'll come back to burials in a moment. I think it was a place where lost souls floated around indefinitely. No pain, no feelings, just an aimless existence, neither a good nor a bad place. The main point was that they were lost souls going nowhere, with no escape route, unlike purgatory, where there was hope. Now, not everyone, most people thought it was a gloomy or not terribly pleasant place, but a small minority had different views. One described it as a lovely, peaceful place, but lonely. A happy enough place. We spent our childhood at All Souls' Night in and out of the church, praying for the relatives who had died, to send them from limbo and help them enter heaven. All the parish did this, saying one Our Father, 10 Hail Marys, and one Glory be to the Father each. We spoke to no one while doing this. It was always very dark. You could only barely make out the other 100 people doing the same. But it was a ritual. I liked doing it. I felt I was helping the relatives who had died. It made a connection with them. And I think that's a very vivid picture of popular Catholic pietism as it related to communion with the dead and the plight of souls in the other world. And of course it's in accord with a long-standing Christian belief in a community of the living and the dead. And a belief which is found in many religions. Now, it's fairly apparent from the survey that limbo meant different things to different people. But there's no doubt that most viewed it as an undesirable place or state of being. And there's another feature which, these are relatively, these are vivid accounts of what limbo looks like, but in terms of readings I've done, limbo is very thinly sketched indeed, very little detail, unlike, say, hell or purgatory, which is an interesting aside, I think. Incidentally, I should say I have a feeling that this particular respondent is mixing up elements of purgatory and limbo. But, that is her view of what was going on. Now, to say this about the timing of baptism, in view of the potential danger of one's child ending up in limbo and facing the prospects of distress of one kind or another, there was an admirable emphasis on having the infant baptised as soon as practicable. And of course, in the past, this was all the more important in periods of high infant mortality, as was the case in most parts of Europe prior to the Second World War and antibiotics and so on. So the communal experience of child mortality and popular understandings of religious duties served to reinforce each other. And it was church orthodoxy, but of course we always wonder, are these orthodoxies translated into practice? Now the evidence isn't very strong, the empirical evidence, but there is some. I've looked at 3 parishes, one in Belfast, St Mary's, the oldest parish in the town, Borrisoleigh, County Tipperary, and one on the Dingle Peninsula, Balliona Eric, very tip of the Dingle Peninsula, and an Irish-speaking area. And in all, I can just summarise here, in all three cases, it's kind of a story of two halves. The first half of the 20th century, most infants were baptized within 1 to 2 days. And I need to look at the statistics in a bit more detail, but I see very little difference between those widely separated, one, a major urban centre, one in deepest, darkest Tipperary, and the other in the wonderful Dingle Peninsula. Oh yes, that was another one. Actually, yes, perhaps pause on that for a moment. This was a more sceptical view. I should have shown it to you. This woman, this mother, thought Limbo was a place of happiness, but she also goes on to say she hasn't really thought very much about heaven, hell, purgatory, limbo, or whatever. And if you look at the questionnaire as a whole, she comes across clearly as quite sceptical of religious belief. My parents were Catholic and practiced, as was laid down. The previous generation, my granny, thought all of these departments were up in space and wondered, did the astronauts see any sign of heaven? Now, the point I was just making about the interval, in relation to the survey, this is what we find. Really, what is it about? Yes, 3/4 have their first infant baptized, first baby baptized within the first month. Now remember, many of these are the late 60s, 1970s, on into the 1980s. So it's to some extent a different Ireland, and I'll illustrate that point now. Oh, just before doing that, just to give a comparative view, these data are taken from Paul Gray's PhD thesis on illegitimacy in 19th century Ireland. So, days along the vertical axis, and what Paul found, and some others have looked at this as well, and the findings are broadly similar. Presbyterians, Church of Ireland, members of those congregations, certainly by the 1810s, 20s, 30s, are not rushing to have infants baptized immediately. By the end of the 19th century, 70 days in the case of Presbyterians, so about 10 weeks gap. And wider still, I've looked at a Presbyterian community in Tipperary in the 20th century, and it could be 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever. The green here refers to the Catholic populations, and by the 1880s, 90s, 1900, really about 1 day on average gap between birth and baptism. Now I can show that in greater detail in relation to Borrisoleigh in County Tipperary, which I mentioned. It's quite consistent with what we've been looking at. In the early 20th century, a gap of about 1 day. I used 3 measures: the median, the mean or average, if you like, and the mode. They pretty well track each other until the later period, so it doesn't really matter which you look at particularly. The median is probably the best measure because it's not sensitive to extreme values like an adult baptism or whatever. But there's very little to choose, and really up to the late 1950s, it's infants are being baptized within 1 or 2 days, and then the gap widens and widens, and by the 21st century, I don't have that there, but you're talking about 3 months, 4 months gap. So now I don't want to go into this too much because it's getting away from the survey, but it's perhaps helpful nonetheless as a piece of background to have a look at infant mortality rates in Ireland over the course of the 20th century. And what you see, you might think some of these figures rather frightening, that 80 out of every 1,000 babies born die within 1 year. So 8 per 100, let's say, and it doesn't change very much during the early decades of Irish independence. And then post-Second World War, infant mortality spirals downwards. For the 19th century, I would think about 1 in every 10 newborn children die. And incidentally, Ireland is not out of line. In fact, it's better in the 19th century than, and for some of the 20th century, as compared to Denmark, France, Sweden. Sweden's the blue. Actually, Sweden has a very good record. Has a poor record to begin with, and by the 1900s is beginning to outperform many parts of Europe. I won't show it, but I do have data on southern Europe and Russia, and the figures are, absolutely horrific in terms of infant mortality. Ireland, the green, broadly in the mainstream, and in the 19th century, rather better, if you can believe the registration system, which of course is. But that's a problem not just for Ireland, but for other countries as well. Now, I want to move on to the disposing of the corpses of unbaptized babies. Now, before commenting on that, let me say a little bit more generally. The Irish countryside contains many reminders of how unbaptized babies were disposed of in the past. I know Sean's written on this in one of his earlier works. The Irish language term killeen refers to patches of ground where unbaptized babies, and sometimes suicides and strangers whose baptismal status was unknown, they were buried in these killeeni. I've also come across a reference, I don't know if this is representative, but that pregnant women who died before giving birth might also be excluded from consecrated ground. I'm very glad if anyone has any comments on that. Now, some parishes had more than one killeen, so there may well have been thousands of these dotted across the island at one time or another. And many have softened into the landscape. Actually, I'll show you a picture of one. That's one on the Dingle Peninsula. It's not, the text here refers to a killeen in County Antrim. And there are very strong similarities between the description and the photograph that's there. There's one called Lignakilla in the townland of Monynay, near the foot of the mountain. It's a platform nearly circular and 75 feet in diameter. It's still used as a burial ground for stillborn children and children not baptized. Now, that was in the 1830s, but those practices in different parts of Ireland continued until at least the 1950s. So let's go back and see what the mothers in the sample said. Well, they reported that in their particular parish, 30% of them, let's say 1/3, said stillbirths and unbaptized babies, if that was the case, were buried in the family grave. Others referred to 17% or so other parts of the cemetery. And remarkably, because we're talking now about the 1960s, 1970s, on into the 1980s, 1/5 were buried outside the cemetery, and quite a number didn't know what the practice was. Now, the practice of excluding unbaptized babies from Catholic cemeteries, as we know from the work of Sean and others, goes deep in time, possibly to the 16th and 17th centuries and the aftermath of the Counter-Reformation. I have no idea what might have happened before that. The unbaptized, to reiterate the doctrinal side, the unbaptized were not part of the Christian community by virtue of not having had the stain of original sin taken from their souls. Now, we know that in some localities there was a kind of compromise, and that was to designate an obscure part of the cemetery as a burial ground for unbaptized babies. In Middleton in County Cork, there's a part of the cemetery which is set aside for that purpose. And you hear somewhat similar comments in relation to Milltown Cemetery in Belfast and Glasnevin in Dublin. Now, let me say a little bit, let the mothers say a little bit about how they experienced and felt this. This is one. I was born in 1948 in my grandparents' house on a Sunday morning and was baptized the following Sunday in church. I was the eldest of 10 children. But in 1954, I had a sister born named Marion, as it was Marion Year in Ireland. It's often a good clue as to someone's age. She was born on a Saturday, but died the next day. As was customary then, my dad had to take her little body late at night, well after dark, to an old graveyard, and on the perimeter of the graveyard, my dad had to bury her with no grave markings, an unknown grave. These are all her words. But at the time, he made a little cross shape tied together with twine, made from 2 sticks, and stuck them in the ground. Every year my dad used to take me to Marion's grave to say a little prayer. There are quite a number of testimonies like that, which I think are enormously important in terms of understanding the depth of feeling surrounding these practices. Some speak of burying unbaptized babies in ditches, in disused graveyards, and so on. So, why the decline in the belief in limbo? And I want to emphasise the doctrine of limbo has deep roots in time, which makes it all the more surprising why in the second half of the 20th century there should have been, a radical revision of these kinds of practices. Just to give you an idea of perhaps the historical depth to these beliefs, Theobald Stapleton's Catechismus, written in both Latin and Irish and published as early as the 1630s, refers to the necessity of baptism. He uses the term Bashla Aun, which I presume is water of the river, which might suggest some form of immersion, but that's pure speculation on my part. And he also speaks of the existence of a place apart for unbaptized infants. Now, it's true that Stapleton complained of the general ignorance of Catholic doctrine in his time, hence the need for a catechism in the language of the people. But it seems that beliefs relating to baptism and limbo, as well as to purgatory and hell, were propagated from the early modern period onwards. And so the deep-seated, deep-rooted nature of these traditions makes the withering of belief in limbo in the late 20th century all the more striking. For generations of Irish Catholic mothers, the pain and joy of giving birth was closely associated with infant mortality and fear of limbo. Adherents of Irish Protestant denominations, as we've seen earlier, entertained no such apprehensions. as these faiths did not include a belief in limbo. And within Catholic Ireland, the existence of Killini and the exclusion of unbaptized babies from sacred ground points to fear-dominated connections between birth, baptism, and the world beyond the grave. Limbo was the spectre that haunted motherhood and birth-giving. I don't think it's here. John Brewer, I just want to refer to something a paper John Brewer gave birth to a little while ago on sociology and theology, which I found intriguing and enlightening. Is it what John's looking at are the intersections between social sciences, sociology in particular, which is very critical, and theology. And we see, according to John Brewer, the re-emergence of a whole range of issues in late modernity. Don't know what comes after that. The re-emergence of a whole range of issues in late modernity that have close connections to theology. And he has an inventory of these issues. Forgiveness, empathy, compassion, compromise, love, hope, mercy, suffering, anger. And he goes on to say that theologians may have a better understanding of these kinds of concepts than sociologists. And dare I say it, maybe historians as well. Be that as it may, having looked across the testimonies of these 26 remarkable women and their recollections of limbo, I would add one further word to John Brewer's inventory, and that is fear, which perhaps theologians understand particularly well also. Now, moving to I suppose, one of the big questions, the declining belief in limbo. And here I will just summarise very quickly. It boils down to an explanation in terms of change in attitudes on the part of people or a change from within the Catholic Church. And again, one could elaborate on these, and it's interesting to look at the individual responses, but roughly 3/4 of the respondents felt it was the people, the laity, who had brought about these changes in Irish society. 1/4 felt it was change from within the Catholic Church. So in terms of what they say in relation to the people changing, they put the emphasis on education, perceptions of falling infant mortality, the media, somebody mentions Gay Byrne along the way, more questioning attitudes in Irish society from the 1960s, and more independent thinking. One woman commented, I quote, "People think limbo is a cruel place and don't think that children go there. They believe in a more merciful God and that children will go to heaven directly." I'm tempted in relation to this to summon up Roy Foster's playful phrase, Catholics becoming more Protestant. Now, in relation to the minority, he said saw the changes as endogenous, as coming from within the Catholic Church. One mentions, and there are elaborations on this and others, by the beginning of the 1970s, there was a new way of baptism where the priest welcomed the mum, dad, baby, and other members of the family at the door of the church, and the priest blessed the whole family. So, a conception of a very different relationship between church and laity, and I would suggest perhaps between priests and people as well. So, to move towards the conclusion, I have no idea how long. Oh yeah, good. Because I'd like to have as much time for discussion as possible, because I'm very much in the business of learning at the moment on all of this. So, to move towards a conclusion. The winds of social change blew increasingly strongly through Irish society in the second half of the 20th century. And within that context of change, one of the least remarked shifts within Irish society has been the transition from early to late baptism. And yet it's one replete with emotional, social, theological and gender implications. The gradual and largely unremarked drift towards late baptism meant that the mother, who after all bears the burden of childbirth, can be present at the joyous moment of introducing the infant into the family and into her community of faith. And an occasion enhanced, of course, by the presence of friends, relatives and loved ones. And of course the effect of all of that is that the mother is no longer excluded from the ceremony as in times past. Because there was the great irony. The woman who bore the child, the infant, from conception to birth and pain and worry that went with that, under traditional baptism practices was excluded from the ceremony. Now, the survey I've outlined is primarily concerned with belief in limbo and its subsequent demise, as seen from the viewpoint of women. And a different study that focused on men only might reveal different patterns, but I don't know. And let me add, it's impossible to read through the body of testimonies as a whole without forming the impression that many Irish mothers suffered silently the intense pain of miscarriage, of stillbirth, or of infant death. And this hidden suffering surfaces from time to time in the responses. And bear in mind, we're talking about high fertility, largely non-contraceptive society, such as that of Catholic Ireland before the 1960s. So women were exposed to the risk of pregnancy over extended time periods. And as a consequence, many Irish mothers must have experienced one or more of those life tragedies that I mentioned a moment ago. In addition to the normal human experiences of suffering and loss, some may also have been burdened by feelings of guilt regarding the fate of unbaptized infants or fetuses. There's a field of work here, it seems to me, for statutory agencies and voluntary organisations in bringing this suppressed pain into the open and helping bring closure, at least to some extent, to those who have suffered loss in the course of pregnancy